At 18, he became one of the most feared robbers in his ghetto. By 26, he was standing in a courtroom with his head bowed, listening to a judge sentence him to 8 years in prison. But that is not the end of his story, because the same boy who once chose the path of crime would one day rebuild his life from the ground up. This is the story of a young man who lost everything, found love in the most unexpected place, and discovered that it is never too late to change. Long before the courtroom, before the prison gates closed behind him, and before the mistakes that nearly destroyed his future, there was just a small boy growing up in a place where life was never easy. His name was David, and he was born in a crowded neighborhood many people simply called the ghetto. The streets there were narrow and dusty, lined with old houses whose walls carried the marks of many years of hardship. Children played barefoot in open spaces between buildings, kicking around worn-out balls while mothers called out from their doorways. Life in that neighborhood moved with a strange mixture of noise and resilience. There were the sounds of traders shouting prices in the market, buses honking impatiently along the main road, and the constant metallic clanging from roadside workshops where men repaired everything from motorcycles to broken generators. David's family lived in a small two-room house with a rusted zinc roof that rattled loudly whenever the wind blew. It was not much, but inside those walls lived people who worked tirelessly to survive. His father, Samuel, was a mechanic. Every morning before the sun fully rose, Samuel would wash his face with cold water from a plastic bucket, put on his worn blue overalls, and walk to his tiny workshop near the roadside. The place smelled constantly of engine oil, fuel, and hot metal. Broken car parts were scattered everywhere, and old engines sat waiting patiently to be repaired. To many people, it looked messy and chaotic, but to Samuel it was a place of pride. It was where he earned the money that kept food on the table. David often followed his father to the workshop when he was younger. He would sit on an overturned paint bucket in a corner and watch carefully as his father worked on different vehicles. Samuel had strong hands that moved with surprising patience. When a car arrived making strange noises, he would lean close to the engine and listen carefully before touching anything. Sometimes he closed his eyes for a moment, as if the machine was whispering a secret only he could understand. David once asked him how he always seemed to know what was wrong with a vehicle. Samuel laughed softly and wiped grease from his fingers with a rag. "Machines speak," he said. "Most people just don't take the time to listen." To David, his father was not just a mechanic. He was a problem solver, a quiet hero who could bring broken things back to life. And because of that, David began to dream. One day, he wanted to understand machines the same way his father did. Only he wanted to go even further. He imagined himself becoming an engineer, someone who built powerful machines rather than simply fixing them. Whenever he told his father about these dreams, Samuel would smile with quiet pride and place a hand on his shoulder. "Study hard," he would say. "Your future doesn't have to stop here." David's mother, Grace, worked just as hard as Samuel. She sold fruits in the busy market several streets away from their home. Every morning she carefully arranged oranges, bananas, pineapples, and pawpaws into a large tray that she balanced perfectly on her head. Then she walked long distances under the hot sun, calling out to passing customers with a voice that carried across the crowded streets. The work was exhausting, but she rarely complained. She believed deeply that the sacrifices she and her husband made would give their son opportunities they never had. For many years, life followed this simple rhythm. David went to school during the day, helped his mother with small chores in the evening, and spent weekends watching his father work at the mechanic shop. Their family did not have wealth, but there was laughter in the house and hope for the future. Then one afternoon, when David was 15 years old, everything changed. Samuel had been working under a bus engine that day. The sun was high, and the heat pressed heavily on the small roadside workshop. Other mechanics were busy with their own repairs when suddenly Samuel stopped moving. At first, no one noticed anything unusual. But after a few moments, one of the men called his name. There was no response. They quickly pulled him out from under the vehicle and realized something was terribly wrong. Samuel's breathing had stopped. They rushed him to the nearest clinic, but by the time they arrived, it was already too late. The doctor shook his head slowly and explained that Samuel had suffered a sudden heart failure. David could barely understand the words when the news reached him. It felt unreal, like something that only happened in distant stories, not in his own life. But the truth did not change. The man who had guided him, the man who believed in his dreams, was gone forever. The small mechanic workshop closed soon after that day. Without Samuel there to run it, the tools were packed away and the space eventually rented to someone else. Their house grew quieter. The absence of his father left a silence that seemed to echo through every corner of their home. Grace tried to remain strong for her son. She worked longer hours in the market, sometimes leaving before sunrise and returning late in the evening. But even with all her effort, life became much more difficult. Money that had once been enough for basic needs now barely covered rent and food. School fees became a constant worry. David finished his secondary school education 3 years later, but by then the reality of their situation had become clear. College was simply impossible. There was no money to continue his studies, and no relatives were wealthy enough to help. For the first time, David began to feel trapped. He spent months searching for work. He visited mechanic shops across the city, hoping someone might allow him to learn the trade the way he had once watched his father do. But every place he visited gave him the same response: no vacancy. Days passed slowly. The frustration built quietly inside him. Each time he returned home empty-handed, he could see the worry in his mother's eyes. She never blamed him, but the pressure was always there. That was when he started spending more time with a group of young men from the neighborhood. They were slightly older than him and seemed to move through life with confidence. They wore nice clothes, rode motorbikes, and always had money in their pockets. At first, David simply joined them to escape the boredom of endless days with nothing to do. They sat together in street corners, laughing loudly and telling stories late into the night. But everyone in the neighborhood knew what those men really did. They were robbers. One evening, as the group sat talking under the dim light of a street lamp, one of them turned to David and spoke quietly. "You've been looking for work, right?" David nodded. "Well," the man continued, "there's another way to make money." David understood immediately what he meant. His heart began to beat faster. For a moment, he thought about his father's words, about the dreams he once had. But those dreams felt distant now, like something from another life. "What kind of job?" he asked. The man smiled. "An easy one." That night, David crossed a line that would change his life forever. The first robbery filled him with fear. His hands trembled as they approached their target, and every sound made him feel as though the police might appear at any moment. But when the job ended and the money was divided among the group, something inside him shifted. For the first time in months, he held enough cash in his hands to solve many of his immediate problems. Fear slowly turned into confidence. Confidence slowly turned into a habit. Within a year, David had become one of the most dependable members of the group. They robbed small shops, intercepted delivery vehicles, and sometimes broke into houses during quiet nights. Each successful operation made them feel more powerful, more untouchable. Yet deep inside, a quiet discomfort remained. Every time David returned home and saw his mother's tired face, something inside him whispered that he was walking down the wrong road. Years passed this way, until David reached the age of 26. It was during that time that something unexpected entered his life. Her name was Sarah. They met at a small roadside food stall one evening while David was waiting for a plate of rice and stew. Sarah was sitting nearby, speaking softly with the woman who owned the stall. She had a calm presence that seemed completely different from the rough energy of the streets David was used to. Over time, they began to talk. What started as simple conversations slowly turned into friendship and eventually something deeper. But Sarah noticed things about David that made her uneasy. The late nights, the sudden money, the company he kept. One evening, she looked directly into his eyes and said words that shook him. "David, the life you're living will destroy you." At first, he tried to deny everything, but Sarah was not easily fooled. She believed that he was capable of becoming a better man, but only if he was willing to face the truth about the path he had chosen. For weeks, those words echoed in his mind. Then one night, after a long conversation with her, David made the most difficult decision of his life. He turned himself into the authorities. The trial shocked many people who knew him. When the judge finally delivered the sentence, the courtroom fell silent. 8 years in prison. It was a heavy punishment, but strangely, David felt something unexpected as he listened to those words. Relief. The running was finally over. While he was serving his sentence, the police launched a raid against the hideout of his former gang. The confrontation turned violent, and by the time it ended, Every member of the group had been killed in a shootout with officers. David was the only one still alive. Life inside prison was difficult, but he refused to waste the years ahead of him. His mother visited whenever she could manage the long journey, and Sarah continued to come as well, offering encouragement and reminding him that his life could still change. Then in his fourth year of imprisonment, devastating news reached him. His mother had suffered a heart attack and died suddenly. The pain nearly crushed him. For days he could barely speak. But eventually that grief transformed into determination. He promised himself that he would become the man his mother always believed he could be. For years later, the prison gates opened. 8 years had passed. Sarah was waiting outside. Together, they embarked on rebuilding a life that had once seemed absolutely impossible. David discovered work in a modest mechanic workshop, saving every single penny he could possibly earn. Eventually, he was enrolled in school and decided to pursue a degree in mechanical engineering, the dream he had shared with his father since childhood. Years later, that very same young man who had grown up within the confines of the ghetto and nearly lost everything stood confidently with a prestigious certificate in his hands. And not long after that remarkable day, he found himself marvelously engaged in a loving marriage to the woman who had never stopped believing in him wholeheartedly. Because, at times, a person's past does not necessarily determine their future. Sometimes the greatest victory a person can achieve is not fame, wealth, or recognition, but the quiet courage to change. It is the strength to look back at the mistakes, the wrong turns, and the pain left behind, and still decide that tomorrow can be different. True victory is found in the moment a person chooses growth over regret, hope over despair, and a better path over the one that once led them astray. Because in the end, the bravest thing anyone can do is not to pretend they were never lost, but to find the courage to become someone better than they were yesterday. For more stories, like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.